So many people ignore their podcast analytics on Apple because you need your Apple ID, and that's such a pain. But let's go through it because it's really important that you understand some of the things that you can discover when you get in it. Today, we're going to talk about Apple Podcast Connect, which is totally a pain if you don't know your Apple ID, but it's important for your podcast analytics. So let's go over here and check it out. So we have some of the podcasts that we run right now, and I'm going to go ahead and just click on one of them. And obviously, you're going to get some of the information here. You can go to episodes if you'd like, but we just want to go to analytics. Now, if you don't have Apple Podcasts Connect, you can absolutely be in a position right now where you have what's called a podcast hosting platform. And that podcast hosting platform is what is sending your podcast out to Spotify, Apple, Castbox, Overcast, Amazon Music, all these things. Now it's sending it to all these, but you still need to go into each of these platforms when you can and get the individual analytics from it. Even though your podcast host can give you a lot of analytics and break it down by platform, it's always good to go to like the source. That's why we're on Apple Podcast Connect. So again, find your Apple ID and make sure you get in there. And now we are going to look at some podcasts. So the first thing we want to look at is you have your overview, you have trends, episodes, and performance, and then all time. Okay, we are just going to do this incredibly briefly. This is not meant to be a deep dive whatsoever. It's just meant to kind of illuminate or illustrate whatever this is telling me to say right now, what you should be paying attention to if you haven't, because it's probably going to help you make better content. So the first thing we're going to see is that there's 161 followers. And if you don't know what any of these are, just click on it. So the number of people who follow the show, got it. Listeners, the number of unique devices that have played it, more than 0 seconds. Anything, any stat that is at least 0 seconds just means someone pressed play. It doesn't mean they listen much longer at all. So I hate those loaded stats because they don't serve us. It doesn't help us help our clients. It doesn't help you make better decisions, but you can use it as a barometer to continue to ascend. So if I'm at 250, maybe my goal for the rest of the month is to get to 300 somehow, and I got to do a lot more outreach. Engaged listeners is huge. The number of devices that have played at least 20 minutes or 40% of an episode within a single session. Pausing or stopping does not count as starting a new session. No problem. Okay. I'll take it. Okay. 40% of an episode or 20 minutes. I mean, just think of YouTube. Like, what's your average viewer duration on YouTube? If you have someone who's listening to 20 minutes out of 30 or 20 out of 40 of your podcast, or 40% of it, that's a fantastic sign. Then lastly is plays. I spent probably an hour with my team this morning about how plays on Apple Podcast Connect is the most ridiculous, nonsensical metric there is. So I'm going to tell you to avert your eyes to plays because it truly doesn't freaking matter. November is when we launched, I think we had a trailer, and then we actually launched the show in December, and then January. Okay, so they're gaining, okay? And this is a newer podcast, of course. And right now we're currently in March. Now, this is just Apple. This does not mean how many people are following or listening to the show as a whole. 232 hours, 76% of the people are people who are actively following the show, who press the plus sign on Apple and say, yeah, I'll add you to my podcast rotation. 24 are not. So that's 56 people. We could do better there. That means the word is not spreading enough, in my opinion. So let's kind of get that bumped up a little bit. Then it's going to tell you countries and regions, and then cities that people are listening to. That's always kind of interesting. If you see cities that are abroad, that means you need to be able to talk to your international audience a little bit more and just be like, hey, for those of you listening in Toronto, it doesn't matter what the number is. You just have to address them so they know, hey, like, they're paying attention to the people who are listening. Then you go down to recent episodes, and here's where we're going to kind of get the majority of what we need. Now, again, this is based off all time stats. So that means whatever you're seeing for this episode 10, these are the stats all time ever since the show has began of people who've listened to this specific episode. So we're 18 episodes in, all right, and we could go to duration. And let's see. So we have 8 listeners. So at the time of recording this is less than a day old. So we're not going to have the stats that we need. So I always ignore that one. And let's just go to why every founder should create content. Okay. Now there's a couple things that I could do here. I could look at these stats, or I could also click on it. Okay. So I'm going to go back to the initial one first. It's going to give me the release date. It's going to tell me how long it is. And I promise you that paying attention to how long your podcasts are is probably one of the most important things you can do, because we have found overwhelmingly the shorter the better. I am all about being an ambitious podcaster who's trying to do an hour and a half of just amazing content, but that's hard for anyone. Caveat, if you're doing interviews, that's another story, but you could still break up those interviews a little bit. And that guest better be bomb. So 30 listeners, and then 19 engaged listeners. Okay, engaged listeners are people, again, the 20 minutes or 40%. So I'm going to do what I like to call my listener to engaged listener ratio. So 19 divided by 30, because I'm not smart. 63. Okay, 63% of the people who initially listened, 6 out of the 10 people who initially listened to 40% or more of the episode, or 20 minutes of this 26 minutes, which, thank you, Apple, for not telling us which one it is. 122 plays. Again, it's complete BS. Average consumption is 72%. That means, well, I'll actually go show you, but 72%, we could actually just click on it. How much of an episode is consumed by a listener on average? That's fantastic. 72 is good. Our best clients have some episodes in the 90s, some high 80s, but I would say if you're just starting out, anything in the 70s or above is fantastic. Now let's click on an episode. Now, this is very, very normal. So you are going to see here the 30 listeners at the outset, and 15 seconds into it, there's 27, and actually a bunch of people stay. So that's pretty good. They didn't lose anyone after the first minute. There's usually a big drop after that first minute, but there's pretty good retention here. This is good. So I might pay attention to minute 13. Okay. There's a drop from 20 to 18. All right. Before that, it wasn't that bad. There's no big drops. And then everyone here listened basically all the way through. Is there anything that happened between minute 12:45 and 13? Was there something that turned people off, a couple people off, enough for them to be like, I'm out of here? And then it's weird. It goes back up to 19. That could be, and we're still trying to verify this, if someone skips ahead, but I don't understand how that takes you off as a listener. I mean, that's it. Now, how do you use this data? Okay, this is not a deep dive, but you're just going to look for patterns. I could tell you for sure. Let's look at duration. So 28 people for an hour and 10-minute episode, 59% consumption. Okay. Yeah. 14 engaged, so 50% engaged listener to engaged listener ratio, because in my opinion, it's long. Everyone was used to some of these shorter ones, and then they get an hour and 10 minutes. I'm not sure they're going to look at that and give it everything they got. Let's look at consumption. Highest consumption was very good engaged listener to engaged listener ratio, 22-minute episode, getting it right versus being right. Very good, 86%. Okay, what can we do to simulate that environment? And that's basically all we're going to do. Looking for the most engaged listener to engaged listener ratio. That is, again, my personal thing. If you want to go to trends, you can. I'm not going to deep dive into that, but if you click on, let's see, this is January, it's going to tell me in all the episodes for December, there was 96 downloads, 87 in all of January. And then if I want to go to episodes, basically I was just there. And then performance, we could look at a couple things. This is just going to compare against the mean and some of the changes, but I'm going to leave it there. So you might be looking at these numbers and being like, oh, like 18 episodes in and that's all that's going on. Again, this is just Apple. I'm going to do Spotify right after this on another episode, and then we'll do a couple other places, but this is just one area. This is not the totality. The totality of all the listeners and downloads and all that kind of stuff will be in your podcast host. A podcast host, again, is who distributes your stuff to all the podcast players. There's ones out there like Captivate.fm, which we love. There's Buzzsprout, which you might know. Libsyn, which you might know. Here's the thing. Apple and Spotify don't have the same analytics. Apple has BS plays, Spotify has starts and streams. It's different. So when you lump it all together, it can be useful, but it could also just be one of those things where it's the stories that you're telling yourself. Like, what are the numbers telling me? So I think it's important for you to know how to get into Apple Podcast Connect. Make sure you go in there regularly. I just worked with one of my clients. His name's Chris Doe. He's my business coach. I mean, big YouTuber, big podcaster. He picked us up, and I realized, like, who's going into your Apple podcast? He's like, I don't know. He doesn't. So I'm like, well, we need to get in there. So for Chris, we're going to be able to make a lot better decisions because we're going into some of these platforms individually, not just in the totality. So if that helped you, stick around because we're going right to Spotify and I'm going to show you some of the analytics there.